Hello and welcome. You're watching NewsX. I'm Megha Sharma and we are just hours away from the historical US presidential elections voting that is going to begin in just a few hours from now. Joining me on the telecast is Adrian Calamel. He's a fellow at the Arabian Peninsula Institute. I also have with me Cleo Pascal, who's a non-resident senior fellow at the Foundation of Defense of Democracies. Thank you, both of you, for joining me on the telecast. Adrian, the first question, of course, about the voting numbers. Early voting, you know, it's almost unprecedented. There is a trend that has been followed from 2020. There are almost 80 million people who've cast their vote. Do you think this is because of the trend that was set up in 2020? It was an outlier. It was COVID that the world was suffering from. And now people have just followed it up in 2024 as well.
Well, that's a good question. Thank you for having me. I really think it's both parties understand that voter turnout matters. When you don't turn up to vote, you're not going to win. And Republicans, when they show up to vote, they generally win elections. When they don't, they don't. Right now, we have a situation where a lot of people will just show up to vote against certain personalities. And I think that's driving a lot of people to the ballot box and to make these votes. That's what I witnessed in 2020. Okay. I saw people that were my age that had never filled out a ballot in their life.
You know, 158 million people who cast their vote in 2020. Do you think, Cleo Pascal, that number is going to exceed this time around more than those number of people, more than those voters who came out and decided to cast their ballot? Is that going to then carry forward to 158 million, increasing to 160 million or even more?
No, but what's interesting about the early voting numbers is that voters tend to follow the direction of the leaders. And in this case, as Mr. Calamel pointed out, you know, the Republicans actually made an effort to try to get voters out early. Traditionally, Republican voters vote on election day, but the leadership has made a point of saying get out early. It's in the context of having concerns about what might happen on election day itself. So you're seeing increasing numbers, but actually you're seeing more Republicans and you're seeing not as many of the Democrat voters, especially in the swing states, that you would see coming out. So it's not just the numbers, but it's who is voting has changed substantially since the last time around. And so as a result, it's hard to say what the final number will be because we don't know whether that's just leeching off of an election day vote or whether this actually is new voters, especially on the Republican side. Although it looks like these may be low propensity voters that are getting out to the polls for the first time, maybe in 4 election cycles.
Okay, all right. Adrian, you know, there has been this narrative that has already been built by Donald Trump in a number of his rallies that he has spoken. He's already disputing the elections. He's talking about how paper ballot is what that needs to be brought back into the US elections. He wants swift election results, and keeping in mind that there are so many early voters, postal ballots that have been cast, people have come in early and cast their vote. The probability of the election results being announced by the end of 6th November are slim.
Yeah, that's never going to happen in this day and age. Going back to an older system, the one that we had, I think it was safer. I think there was less room for manipulation, or even the thought of manipulation when you just went in and you pulled down on the levers and closed the curtain behind you. Things have dramatically changed. There's also absentee ballots that go out. I don't know. It has to come down. What needs to be done, there needs to be voter identification. There needs to be simple voter identification. And the problem is we cannot have people questioning our elections. And this is what this has come to. And I think there's reason for people to question the elections right now, especially in this digital age when campaigns have been hacked into. Who's to say these voting systems aren't going to be hacked into, or there isn't manipulation at some point?
Cleo, would you like to respond? Is the concern shown by Donald Trump legitimate?
So Meg, as you know, I'm a Canadian, and I voted in my school board elections 2 days ago, and I had to have voter ID, and it was a paper ballot, and I had to show up in person. There was one other day to do it, and not sort of a month of, or kind of election season. So and as you know, how the Indian elections are run meticulously. I mean, if the votes can be counted in India and it can be run in a country of substantially larger democracy than both the U.S., obviously, and Canada, then I think it could be done in a different way in the U.S. However, I would probably caution against a centralized electoral system. As you know, each of the 50 states has their own systems, and the U.S. is a unique country. It's set up to be this kind of, the states have a lot of power, and that. I think that's one of the strengths of the system. You can have some of the states go off and do their own thing, and not have it all controlled out of a centralized system, which opens it up to vulnerabilities if you have a certain sort of government and power. But this is something obviously for the American people to decide. It's just perplexing as a non-American to see some of the voting mechanisms that are going on in some of the states.
Right. Adrian, moving on to the swing states, which are going to be the deciding factor. Now, last time around, Joe Biden ended up winning 6 of those 7 electoral college votes, 6 of those states. Poll predictions, several of them that have put out their results are again leaning towards Kamala Harris. 4 of those 7 states is where Kamala is leading if poll projections were to go by. How do you think the swing states are going to vote?
Great question again. I will just put this out there right now that I do not trust polls, period, especially when it comes to presidential races. They are notoriously bad. And we've seen this just in the recent elections. And then we can go back to when Reagan was supposed to be in a fairly difficult battle with Mondale, and he won every state except for Minnesota. So, with that being said, yeah, those swing states are very important. Michigan, Pennsylvania, and when you start to talk about states like Georgia coming into play, North Carolina, and then the smaller states with smaller, I wouldn't say smaller states, but smaller populations, smaller electoral colleges, when there's slim margins, they all of a sudden become more important as well. And those are the states that you would call they're kind of that bluish, pinkish hue right now, and we can't figure out which way they're going to go.
Let's also talk about Iowa, which has been a traditional state that the Republicans, Donald Trump, had won last time around as well. He has raised protest clear after this poll projection was made by a pollster a couple of days ago, giving that state to Kamala Harris, to the Democrats. Again, this individual who has predicted this poll has been accurately predicting elections repeatedly in the past presidential polls as well. So how confident would you be when these poll projections are released?
So I think that's the Ann Seltzer poll that you're talking about. And when you look into the crosstabs, which is where you can see who she's ascribed certain voting to and what numbers are and what her percentage of the electorate is, it's a very odd poll. So yes, she has had a very good track record. There's been some oddness in 1 or 2 of her other polls. This one, it's not, if you look into the details of who she polled, it doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense. She seems to have oversampled, for example, and used too much of the data weighted in favor of older white women who tend to be a group that votes substantially for Harris. And it is very much of an outlier poll. So we'll see. I mean, she could be a genius and better than everybody else, and she's going to prove everybody else wrong. Or it could be an outlier, and even the best pollsters will eventually come up with an outlier, come out with something that is just off. So it's an odd poll, but we'll see. I think that the one really to watch, and which we might get the results quite quickly on, is Pennsylvania. Josh Shapiro, the governor, wants to, I think, be presidential candidate in 4 years for the Democrat Party. So I think he'll probably try to do things as relatively clean. We may get results quite quickly there, and that'll certainly give an indication of the rest of the way things go. It's Pennsylvania for me is really the one to watch.
Okay, all right, Adrian. Talking about the policies that have been talked about by both the candidates during their rallies, during their campaigns, while Kamala Harris has been predominantly focusing on pro-choice, that is a weak point for Donald Trump. But when it comes to economy, when it comes to immigration policies, as per the poll projections, these predictions that have been made, they all are leaning towards Donald Trump. Do you think that is going to be an advantage for him, keeping in mind that he already has proven his mettle? He was the president, while Kamala Harris in the back foot. There are at this point of time comments being made, analysts coming out and saying that she continues to live in the shadow of Joe Biden, who's the current president, and she does not have the experience.
Yes, and you're absolutely right. With Trump, he can point to his past success and talk about the economy. We have to remember, at the end of the day, it's always said about the Americans, they vote with their pocketbook. There's other things that do come up that are very important, foreign policy issues, women's rights, the border, things like that. But when it comes down to it, the most important topic is the person's wallet, their checkbook. And they have seen the last 4 years inflation rise, difficulty paying the mortgage, whatever it may be. And Kamala Harris is trying to distance herself from that, but at the same time, she has no real plan for the forward, has no real policy for addressing these economic problems other than going after corporations for price gouging. Okay, these are the type of things that start to, make people a little bit nervous. When you talk about investigating grocery companies, oil companies, corporations for price gouging because of bad economic policies, people need to see that and need to understand that's not a good trend, and that's moving in the wrong direction.
Mm-hmm. The same question to you, Cleo. Do you think it is going to be in favor of Donald Trump, the way economic policy under his regime when he was the president saw gains for the country, for the economy, which grew? The GDP growth was substantial, inflation was at a low.
Yeah, so normally what you look at for these things is how people rank what's important to them. And the economy obviously is very high for a majority of people, as is security, including border security. It looks like abortion or reproductive rights, however you want to call it, usually comes in around third or fourth for a lot of people in terms of priorities. And interestingly, the retroactive vision of Trump's presidency is improving. So more people look back on his presidency as a success now than they did a year ago or 2 years ago, for example. So those things will definitely factor in. For certain groups that have reproductive rights as number one, that will be their one issue voting. But for a very large number of Americans, you have the other issues, especially around inflation, jobs, security, that sort of thing, is favoring Trump. And even on things like, for example, election integrity, which used to be a Democrat-owned issue when the narrative around January 6th was particularly high. That's now actually shifted in favor of Republicans as there starts to become more people who are questioning the mechanisms of voting and the integrity of the mechanisms of voting. So even when you look at the issue itself, you need to disaggregate what they actually mean when they talk about that issue.
Adrian, would it be unfair to undermine President Joe Biden during his regime, the 4 years? We also saw 2020, the COVID, the pandemic that hit the world, and America was no exception. We saw that the inflation numbers were quite high. We saw the GDP growth was down by a large percentage. We saw that there was lack of jobs. But that's a natural calamity that has happened, and no president, whether it was Trump or anybody from the Republican Party or the Democrats could have done anything about it.
Well, I think we also have to remember that the pandemic started under Trump. There was quite a bit of time, and it was towards the end that really dented his. It was a global impact, and this is when everyone was clutching at straws and not knowing what to do. The Biden administration comes out of this. I'm not going to say how they handled it, whether it was right or wrong. I mean, that's a story for another day. But they've had plenty of time to get the economy back on track, and they have not done that. And we haven't even dived and gone into the foreign policy issues that should, for me, be front and center. They have not been discussed. During 2016 to 2020, we did not see the Afghanistan withdrawal, and that shameful event there. We did not see a war in Ukraine. We did not see the October 7th slaughter take place, and then the Islamic Republic brazenly going after Israel, using all its proxies, and China also saber-rattling in the South China Sea, threatening Taiwan, playing games with the Philippines along maritime rights. You know, foreign policy, for me, should be front and center as well. Mm-hmm. That's just where I am. We haven't talked about it.
Okay, I'm going to come to foreign policy in just a bit, but Cleo, what do you think is Trump doing right this time around 2020? He lost the election. He was anti-vaccine. Do you think that was perhaps one of the primary reasons he lost the election to Joe Biden?
I'm not so sure he was anti-vaccine. In fact, he would argue that he invented the vaccine, of course, with that. I mean, you know, but then there was the whole issue of mandates. A fascinating thing for me, because I was in the U.S. During much of those 2 years, was, again, it showed this unique aspect of the U.S. system, which is where the states have an enormous amount of power. So you could go to Manhattan and everything was locked down, or you could go to Miami and there were farmers markets that were open. And as a result of kind of the difference in governance, you saw a substantial movement of Americans between states, where they were people were going from California to Texas, for example, or you saw Elon Musk moving his company from California to Texas. So the role of governance at the state level, whether it was Democrat or Republican, was attractive or not attractive to Americans, and they were moving to adapt. So that, I think, played into how people understood their relationship to those two parties, those who were concerned about who approved of the lockdowns, and that sort of an approach felt much more secure in Democrat areas. Those who wanted more freedom of movement and action felt more comfortable in the Republican states. And I think it may have been an opportunity for Americans to rethink their political alignments at a time when the country was in crisis.
Adrian, also, let's talk about Kamala Harris's strategy. You know, 60-year-old does not have experience as president. She's fighting against the oldest Republican candidate, oldest presidential candidate, which is Donald Trump, 78 years of age. What do you think is Kamala Harris doing differently than Hillary Clinton, that when she was fighting against Donald Trump in 2016, she lost the election? Remember, she's a Democrat woman presidential election. Do you think sexism is going to work in disadvantageous position for Kamala Harris?
I don't think it is. And Kamala Harris, the biggest problem with her is she's never been elected to anything, as far as I can tell. That's one thing. She was pushed aside. Biden was pushed aside. Basically, they shortened the runway for her. She hasn't come out with any real clear policies. When you watch the ads, she's absolutely campaigning from the middle and trying to campaign from the middle. And you're not hearing anything about New Green Deal and some of the more radical progressive ideas within that wing of the party. Hillary Clinton was a much stronger candidate, as far as I'm concerned. As far as she understood things, she got it. I'm not sure what Kamala Harris has been doing over the last 4 years. I'm sorry, I just don't. She was the border czar. We've seen that's been an unmitigated disaster. She said she was the last person in the room and was acceptable with what happened in Kabul on those last days with people falling from airplanes. Mm-hmm. That's not good enough. So she hasn't done, for me, she hasn't done anything except for, in a lot of cases, it's been demonized. It's been demonized Trump. And it's really easy just to fall back on, January 6th, fascist dictatorship. That's what you're going to get. Okay. And people buy that. It's a simple binary narrative that's been thrown out there.
Okay, all right. If Kamala Harris and the Democrats have been demonizing Donald Trump and calling him a fascist and a Nazi and a dictator, on the other hand, Donald Trump has been obviously building a narrative, disputing the elections is what at this point in time he's set to build the narrative on. The elections are going to, the results are going to then spill on to votes being cast over several days. The results coming in not on November 6th, but it is going to obviously take a few more days till the time elections are called out. Cleo, the same question for you. Kamala Harris, what is she doing differently compared to Hillary Clinton? Both of them women candidates. There has not been a woman president in America in the last century.
There hasn't, but there have been some very strong women leaders, for example, at the governor level or in the Senate. I mean, Nancy Pelosi was, the third most powerful politician for quite a long time. So you have, I don't think it's necessarily that Americans are misogynist or anything like that. It's that there hasn't been a candidate that's suited. I don't think that's an issue. Just based on, again, you've seen very strong. You have, Whitmer. You have quite a few women governors running, and in the Senate and in the House. So I don't think that's the issue. But again, this, as Mr. Calamel said, she doesn't really have a track record, and she's got a difficult position because she can't really trash the Biden administration, which she was a part of. So she can't say how she's going to be different from the Biden administration without disowning her own role in it. And but then if she doesn't do that, then she has to own that, and she has nothing she can show really for it. She's been a very low profile vice president. Okay. So she doesn't have a lot to work with. Let's put it that way.
Okay, let's also shift our focus to the richest man in the world, Elon Musk. And Adrian, does it come as a surprise that Musk has political ambitions, and Donald Trump also hinting that if he were to be the president, Trump will get an important portfolio in his cabinet?
I don't know. It's too hard to say. Elon Musk, I mean, he is definitely a visionary. He continues to do unbelievable things. I think he can, obviously, we all see the erratic side of him at times with some of the things that he says, but we also see that with Donald Trump, and he says things that are erratic. Do we expect to see him in the government in some type of capacity appointed? I'm not sure. We have to remember Arnold Schwarzenegger was one time the fitness czar under one of the Bushes. So maybe Elon Musk does make it there, and hopefully they'll have him in a role where it's technology driven and can improve the United States in the way we use our technology, and improve the world in the way it uses technology. But I think that's too easy. It's hard to say whether he will actually be in there.
Okay. All right, I'm out of time. I thank both of you for joining me on the telecast. But stay on with us. On the other side of this commercial break, we have more analysts, more speakers lined up for you. Remember, US presidential elections voting takes place in just a few hours from now. Thanks for watching NewsX.